A young man got hired to work in the produce section at the supermarket. But every day, as he was setting out the apples and bananas and oranges, he noticed that whenever someone went to buy a cantaloupe, before they would put the cantaloupe into their cart, they would hold the cantaloupe up to their ear and tap on it. But the young man never quite understood why the people were doing that. So one day he went up to an older woman and asked her why she was doing that, why she was holding the cantaloupe up to her ear and tapping on it before putting it into the cart. The woman said, "You want to know why I do that? Why, I've been doing that for 60 years. And I have no idea why I'm doing that. All I know is that if you buy a cantaloupe, that's what you're supposed to do. And if you don't do that, then people look at you like you're out of your mind." What are we supposed to do? What is required of us? That's a question that gets asked quite often. Students ask their teachers, "What's required of me?" And usually the translation is, "What's the least amount of work I have to do in this class to still get a good grade? What's the least number of pages I have to read in the textbook? And what's the least number of classes I have to show up for? What is required of me?" That's also a question that is often asked by new employees of their bosses. What's required of me? And quite often what the question means is, what's the least amount of work I have to do around here to avoid getting into trouble? How early in the morning do I have to show up? And how late in the afternoon do I have to stay? What is required of me? What is required of me? What is required of us? That is the very same question that the people in Micah's day posed to God. They asked that question of God because the people in Micah's day sensed that God was not entirely happy with the way that things were in their society. And so they asked God, "Okay, God, tell us, what is it that you want us to do? What do you require of us? Do you want us to say some extra prayers? Or how about sacrifices? Do you want us to put more cattle and sheep on the altar? Is that what it'll take to make you happy? Do you want us to sacrifice our children? God, what is it? What is it that you require of us?" And how does God answer? God says, "I'll tell you what I require of you. I've told you time and time before. What I require is for you to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." To do justice. What exactly does that mean? Most basically, to do justice from a biblical point of view means to be concerned not just with how things are in our own personal lives, but also to be concerned with how things are in our community, in our nation, in our world. To do justice means to do what is in our power, to face up to the wrongs that are there in the world and do something about them. After all, God requires us to do justice, not just to think about it, not just to hope for it, but to do justice. But the problem is that just like in Micah's day, we religious people people have a tendency to get so involved in religious sort of things that we don't always get around to doing justice. We end up focusing on ourselves and what's going on inside our churches. And then we end up not paying adequate attention to what's going on outside the church. We don't pay adequate attention to the wrongs that are right outside our door. A powerful illustration of that is a scene in the book of Revelation, where Jesus is described as standing outside of the church at Laodicea, knocking on their closed door. Maybe you've seen paintings of that scene. But do you see what the problem is? The people of that church are inside their building, presumably doing religious sort of stuff in there. But Jesus isn't in there with them. Instead, Jesus is outside their church, banging on their doors as if to say, hey, come on out here. This is where I want you to be, facing up to the problems that are out here in the world and doing something about them. Are we willing to do that? Are we willing to do what God requires and do justice? People were rightly shocked at the recent shooting in Tucson that left the Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords seriously injured and 6 others, including a federal judge and a little girl, dead. But even though that incident caught the nation's attention, will that incident have a lasting effect on us? After all, the unfortunate reality is that what happened there in Tucson is not that out of the ordinary for what happens in our country nowadays. Right now in the United States, more than 31,000 people are shot and killed every year. In other words, about 86 people per day. More than 14 times the number that were killed there in Tucson are killed in this country every single day. And it is into the midst of a world such as that God calls us and in fact requires us to do justice. It is into the midst of a world such as that God calls us and in fact requires us to face up to the wrongs that are there and to do something about them. But so often we feel tempted to wonder, well, what can I possibly do? But maybe it's time we gave more serious consideration to what it is we can do. What in the world do you have a concern, a passion for? What in the world is it the problem of violence, hunger, child abuse? Do you have a concern, a passion for the plight of the elderly, the unemployed, the disabled? Do you have a concern, a passion for the problems that exist in the areas of education or healthcare or drug abuse? What is it that you really care about? What is it that weighs on your heart? That's something that also weighs on the heart of God. Then commit yourself to taking some steps, even if at first they might be some small steps.